Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council's Modern Slavery and Infrastructure in the Infrastructure Sector webinar. Really fantastic to see people joining and to join us on this very important topic here today with some amazing speakers. Just as a way of context, you know, actually, if you want to go to that, that'd be great. Thanks, Danielle. Because before we do that, just like to complete our acknowledgement of country. The ISC would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today. I'm joining you here from Te Whanganui Atara in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I encourage people to share the country that they are joining us from today in the chat. That'd be great. We acknowledge the deep connection of elders past, present, and future to the land, water, and culture of our countries, both countries that we're joining from today. So welcome to everybody. And I acknowledge any traditional owners or First Nations people who are joining us at this webinar. The International Labour Organization estimates that over 40 million victims of modern slavery that number globally. Modern slavery includes a range of severe exploitative practices, including slavery, servitude, forced labour, debt bondage, abuse of vulnerability, and other means for the purpose of exploitation. Of the estimated 40 million victims, 25 million people were victims of forced labour, of which 18% are in the construction sector. I was just on a webinar on modern slavery from the UK recently, and we had a survivor of modern slavery sharing with us her story. It was highly impactful, and I think sometimes we think these issues don't happen in our midst, but they do, and we're really pleased to have our speakers and experts kind of share stories today to really emphasise how critical modern slavery issue is in both Australia and New Zealand. The ISC Modern Slavery Coalition has been active since shortly after the legislation was first introduced in the Australian context in 2018. Since then, the coalition have achieved a great deal, and some recent examples is the development of the ISC Impact Note, which aligns modern slavery to the IS rating scheme. And Lauren's going to pop a link to that in the chat. It's also available on our website. The coalition has arranged presentations on by subject matter experts, similar to this one here, but also to build knowledge of the coalition members. They've explored different challenges around modern slavery statements and reporting, made submissions on the Modern Slavery Act review, and have developed a knowledge hub directory for use of useful resources. So also developed and published a supplier risk tool to help smaller and diverse suppliers to identify and understand their risks and red flags in their supply chains. They've explored supply chain traceability in the Australian bitumen supply chain with an aim to create a framework that can be replicated across industry and other materials. And they're also keeping a close eye on developments in New Zealand, and we're going to hear more about that hopefully today. Before I introduce our first speakers, I just want to highlight that the Modern Slavery Coalition is keen to hear from anyone in the audience today that might be interested in joining the group. Their stated intent is to raise awareness, build capability, and develop positive impact towards the ultimate goal of eradication of modern slavery. And this group meets every 6 weeks. Its first meeting for 2024 is at the end, is next week actually, on the 7th of March. So if anyone has interest, or after this webinar has interest, please reach out to the ISC. Andrea Marcus is the person, but I'm sure any of us can help with that. So let me now welcome our speakers. I'm excited to, as you can see there, we're going to have a general overview from Alexander Coward. Alexander is the leading expert on modern slavery, supply chain transparency, and stakeholder engagement. He led the development and implementation of the Modern Slavery Act 2018 here in Australia, and he's the director of Pillar 2. Sebastian Connolly is with Transurban and Sustainable Procurement Manager, and Sebastian's responsible for the responsible sourcing and sustainability. He's responsible sourcing at Transurban, and he's been a sustainability professional for over 17 years, working with domestic and international supply chains. And then our final speaker later in the session is Lucy Forbes. Lucy is the Acting Senior Legal Policy Officer at the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. And Lucy leads the Commissioner's efforts on sustainable procurement in business and human rights. She has practiced in international public and private law at a leading Australian firm, and has a strong record of advising businesses on anti-slavery, environmental and governance obligations under Australian and international law. So an amazing range of speakers. We're very grateful for them for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and expertise. So welcome to all. As you see in the agenda, we've got a couple of Q&A slots. So that will be after Alexander and Sebastian present to us first, and then after Lucy, we'll also have some time for questions. So welcome all, and I'm sure we're going to really get some great insights here today, things that we can take away into the work that we do. And so I'd like to kick off and hand over to Alexander, who's going to give us an overview and talk about the legislative context. Thanks, Alexander.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today we're focusing particularly on two areas relating to modern slavery, and those are, of course, as you saw from the agenda, modern slavery risks in the renewables sector, and then steps taken by the New South Wales government to manage modern slavery risks in its own procurement, which of course include, but aren't limited to, some of those key risks in the renewables area. But before we focus in on those issues, it's important also to understand the bigger legislative context that we all do business in. If you're only based in Australia and New Zealand, then you might perhaps look at this and ask, well, why do all the different parts of this global map matter for me and for our business? And the answer is that they matter because even if your operations are not global, your supply chains, your investors, and often your customers are. And so that means that even while you might not be directly covered by the laws that we're going to talk about, your suppliers, investors, customers, and indeed some of your peers likely are. And it's also important that you can explain internally, including to your board and to key business units, what these laws are and why they matter to your response and to the work that you do to manage and to understand modern slavery risks. And so we're going to take a quick tour through the international and the domestic context. And broadly speaking, looking at the map, you can see there's three main families of law. And each of these types of law really has the same aim. And that aim is to help businesses respect human rights. And under what we call the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, every company has an internationally recognized responsibility to respect human rights. And essentially what this means is that we should all seek to ensure that in doing business, we do no harm to people, whether that's workers in our operations, workers for suppliers, other people in the communities and the areas where we or our business partners operate. And of course, one of the most severe ways that someone's human rights can be harmed is through modern slavery. The UN Guiding Principles themselves are not binding. They're what we call soft law. But what's key is that each of these laws that we're talking about, including our modern slavery legislation here in Australia and the proposed legislation in New Zealand, is taking this soft law expectation around respect for human rights and making it into a hard law obligation. And the type of law, of course, that we know best is probably modern slavery reporting legislation. It's what we have here in Australia from 2018, which builds on an earlier law in the United Kingdom in 2015. And a number of you may already report under both of these pieces of legislation. There's an even earlier law in California from 2010. But we're also seeing more laws springing up modeled on this approach. And there's a law now in Canada, and companies' first reports are due under that at the end of May this year. And of course, there's legislation on the table in New Zealand as well. And the aim of those pieces of legislation is to say to companies that it's important that you disclose the steps that you're taking to manage modern slavery risks that might be present in your operations and across your supply chains. And that by disclosing that information to the market, the view of governments is that that means that the market will then be able to reward companies that are doing the right thing and potentially penalize, or there'll be consequences, market consequences for companies that show in their reporting that they're perhaps not meeting the expectations that stakeholders have. So that legislation is very much focused on this idea of transparency. The second family or type of legislation that we see is around import bans and border measures. And what these are laws that aim to prevent products being imported into a particular country where we think that those products may be made using modern slavery. The most active example of this, which we'll hear a little more about from Sebastian, is a forced labor import ban in the United States. And one of the key areas of focus for that ban has been trying to address the importation of goods, including goods in the infrastructure supply chain, into the US, where those goods have links to state-sponsored forced labor in Western China. We also know the EU is working through a process of developing its own proposal for an import ban. There's a similar framework already in place in other countries, including Canada. And then lastly, we have this kind of third family or type of laws, and these relate not just to modern slavery, but to all types of human rights that businesses can impact. And these laws often include a requirement to undertake what we call human rights due diligence. And that's where they're different from modern slavery laws, which are saying to you it's important that you report on what you're doing, but they're not prescribing the kind of steps that a company should or shouldn't be taking. Human rights due diligence laws are saying companies actually should be taking steps proactively to identify and to manage and to mitigate and prevent potential human rights risks, including modern slavery, and that there should be liability of certain kinds for companies that don't take the steps that they should where harm does occur in their operations or supply chains. Legislation, of course, doesn't always move fast, but these laws, at least in legislative terms, are moving really quickly. And so here in Australia, the Parliament is likely to very soon pass a bill to amend our Modern Slavery Act to create an anti-slavery commissioner. And there was a report last night from the Senate committee that's looking at the bill that recommended that the Australian Parliament pass the legislation. And one of the commissioner's roles will be to work with government to engage with businesses reporting under the Modern Slavery Act. And we anticipate, again, that the infrastructure sector is likely to be one of the areas that national commissioner is looking really closely at. The government in Australia is also in the process of responding to a review of the Modern Slavery Act last year. It's said already that it will include penalties for non-compliance, and it's considering other recommendations as well, which include lowering the reporting threshold and establishing a modern slavery due diligence requirement, which is starting to cross over into that territory of human rights due diligence legislation that we spoke about. Now, these laws and the changes that are proposed to them don't always go ahead. And so, for example, we've seen delays in New Zealand as governments have changed and as priorities are reassessed. And even last night at the European level, an agreed proposal for mandatory human rights due diligence was scuttled at the very last minute by particular political dynamics between countries. But while these different types of legislation don't always proceed, there's a really clear trend towards stronger legislation that sets requirements for companies to understand and to manage their human rights risks, and that includes modern slavery. And it's really helpful and important to be aware of those. And to give you just one practical example of how that can support companies, if you're, for example, doing business with suppliers who are also importing into the United States, you could be asking those suppliers about the steps that they've taken to ensure that they meet the requirements of the US import ban and whether there have been challenges for them in doing that. And so you can see in this broader international context, it's really important that as companies, we're able to know and to show that we're managing modern slavery risks. And as we'll hear later on today, that's especially critical now in the context of procurement by the New South Wales government. But one of the key infrastructure risks is particularly around renewables. And so Sebastian is going to take us through now some of the key issues that are relevant to that area. And Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. So actually, within the ISC's Modern Slavery Coalition, which Kerry mentioned earlier, and we encourage anyone who's interested in joining to join us, we've been discussing many areas of labour-related risks and areas where modern slavery can be involved in the infrastructure space. And I think firstly, I'd like to recognise the work of Anderson Camargo from Ventia, who can't be on the call today to present this. However, he's previously shared this information with the ISC's Modern Slavery Coalition and some of the information and risks on renewable energy and some of those statistics I'll share now. Like any goods and service, the renewable energy sector is not immune to modern slavery or labour rights risks, both offshore in manufacturing and onshore when construction and operation occurs. So if we look at solar, 95% of the world's solar modules use polysilicon, and through the melting and processing, turning the polysilicon into wafers, cells, and into completed PV modules, around 40 to 45% of these panels have been reportedly linked to forced labour. There was even a probe in 2022 as to whether companies producing solar panels or parts in Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand were sourcing materials or components from third countries, including areas of state-sanctioned forced labour. So we're talking about multinational supply chains, being involved in potential instances of modern slavery. But it's not just solar in the renewable sector; it's also wind. And on the next slide, we can see that balsa wood used in wind turbine blades have also been linked to substandard working conditions in Ecuador. And on top of that, there are also additional surrounding issues such as deforestation, offshore wind farms impacting whale migration, bird strikes, and even end-of-life recyclability challenges. And there's lots of news as we turn to the next slide on reports of negative impacts on people right throughout the supply chains, whether that be in source countries or components or materials, or in the labour used to construct infrastructure in Australia or even in New Zealand. By the end of 2022, it had previously been estimated that up to 12 gigawatts of solar modules were detained or rejected from entering the US under the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act that Alex just mentioned earlier. And those panels may have even been re-exported back out of those countries and into other countries where importation bans don't exist. There's a photo there on the bottom left showing miners working in Shabara artisanal cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And cobalt being a high demand material used in lithium ion batteries, enabling high rates of performance and enhancing stability. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo, And the OECD estimates between 20 to 30% of this is mined in these artisanal mines where unsafe labour practices, child labour and forced labour have been widely documented. So what do we do about this? And on the next slide, I guess a simple summary that we've come up with to share with you is that labour rights abuses and modern slavery can occur in any part or operations, in your operations or supply chains at any time and in any location. And these issues are really dynamic. So how do businesses go about meeting customer requests, the legislative requirements that Alex mentioned before, or even their own corporate responsibility to conduct ongoing due diligence? To really simplify it, we should map the processes of all the activities that are involved, as well as the entire, right throughout the entire life cycle. We should look at the parts, components, and raw materials that go into that life cycle. We should identify where people are involved and track those vulnerabilities of people, whether that be casual or undocumented labour in offshore supply chains. It could be labour hire or migrant labour, or even vulnerable people working for you in your local infrastructure builds. And then assessing these practices that may have negative effects on these people. And so to go in more detail on due diligence, there's a few steps that we've recommended on the following slides. So identifying the supply chain, we really recommend collaborating with suppliers to map out each of the steps in the supply chain. Kerry mentioned the traceability exercise earlier. We can map those processes from cradle to gate, and this should provide you with the information to assess risks against the suppliers, locations, the rule of law in these areas, and the vulnerabilities of people in those areas. Not just specifically looking at modern slavery, but also, leading indicators or labour risks involved. And then on the following slide, to address any situations. Mapping the supply chain gives us insights to be able to work with suppliers and our internal business stakeholders to raise awareness, implement policies and controls, reduce the risk to people. And this really strengthens the transparency right throughout the supply chain. And where vulnerable people might require further support, we should have in place mechanisms for people to raise concerns freely, and also, so that we can support any potential or actual victims. And getting down to these steps, simplified steps that we've just highlighted, may take some time and commitment. However, if the infrastructure sector can collaborate and each take ownership, we can all make headway into supporting victims and reducing further risk to people. And there's some great resources available publicly, including links on the impact note that was shared in the chat earlier, as well as some of the great resources coming out of the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. They've also published some great resources as well, and Lucy might talk about those. So I think I'll hand it on to Lucy now, or ask for questions, Gary.
Yep, I'll if I can have Alexander and Sebastian join us. We've had a few questions that have come through, so I'm going to highlight those now. And as Lauren put in the chat, if anyone has any additional questions, put those into the Q&A. So let me kick off with Hayda's question. I mentioned earlier that 18% of the construction sector associated with forced labour, but this question was whether are there any statistics on the number or proportions of modern slavery risk specific to construction projects or their supply chains? So any input that either of you might have in that space?
Sure. So there's some high-level estimates from organizations like the ILO, as we've heard you talking about, Kerry. One of the problems with modern slavery is we know that it's difficult to find and it's underreported, and there are good reasons why people who've experienced it may not necessarily seek help. And so, for example, in Australia, a government estimate a number of years ago determined that it's probably only 1 in 5 survivors of modern slavery who are identified either by government, by business, or by civil society. So the statistics are are helpful, but it's also, I think, important to recognise that they're not telling the full picture. And so while we don't necessarily have a concrete number for people in the construction or infrastructure sector, we do know that it's high, and we do know that it's underreported. And both here in Australia and globally, that we're certainly missing cases because we're not looking in the right ways.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Alexander. The next question is from Lisa. There are a number of recommendations in the Australian Government Modern Slavery Report, one of which was lowering the threshold for reporting. What recommendations are likely to be implemented, and what is the thought process for the timeline?
Sebastian, did you want to start with that one, and I can
Sure.
talk about the timeline?
Sure. I think, Alicia, I think likely that the threshold will be reduced. That's my personal take on it. I think depending whether due diligence requirements are implemented, that will be a question up for debate. However, I'm sure that the Commonwealth and their working groups will provide guidance like they have in the past, available on the Modern Slavery Register. So there's just a couple of examples, and one of those commitments already was the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, which Alex discussed earlier, which is already up before Parliament.
And we know the government seems to be suggesting that they would like to wait for the Anti-Slavery Commissioner to be established to help them work through the recommendations and what they might pursue. And so that would mean then that we're probably unlikely to see a concrete position from government until later in the year. And we're also running up against an election here in Australia as well. So the timing's likely to get quite complicated. But I think irrespective of that, businesses can still look at what those recommendations are and start to prepare for them, and starting to think about how you might engage with some of those smaller suppliers and build their capacity is perhaps a really important place to start.
Thanks for that. I'm just going to jump to a question which I think is kind of related in that, just so we kind of close that off. Is there still hope for the CSDDD?
So the CSDDD, oh, sorry, Kerry.
Yeah, no, if you explain what that is for those who don't know, that'd be great.
So that's one of the examples of mandatory human rights due diligence. It was a proposal for an EU-wide human rights due diligence framework. It made it almost all the way through the EU legislative process and has fallen, or appears to have fallen overnight at really the very last hurdle due to some domestic political considerations at play. There's a lot of effort going on behind the scenes to try and resuscitate it, and really we've got about 2 weeks to see if that's possible. But there's been a great deal of support from businesses, especially, saying we do think it's something that's helpful, and we do want consistency, which is something that I think many of you on the call would sympathise with as well.
Let me just take a couple more questions. We'll keep some to the end after Lucy's spoken, but from Rick Waters, we mentioned renewables and some of the issues related to modern slavery related to renewables. And Rick raises the question about that there doesn't seem to be the same focus on fossil fuel extraction, and what might be your observation, or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can probably say I think there definitely has been a focus on those organisations extracting fossil fuels. If we think about the mining industry, you know, their focus actually extends beyond modern slavery. They've had a lot of human rights risks with mines, you know, domestically and also internationally. And I think, you know, Alex might be able to add to some of the broader human rights issues, environmental issues, and impacts on whether that be First Nations communities or deforestation and things like that, which are along with modern slavery. So it's not just one topic in that sector.
Fantastic, thanks, Sebastian. And I'll just finish off with the question about do we know if there's a Victorian body that looks into modern slavery? So we're talking today, Lucy's going to update us around what's happening in New South Wales, but is there something established in Victoria?
Lucy might also like to perhaps mention that briefly, but there's not an equivalent commissioner-style body in Victoria. So one of the unique things about the Commissioner's Office that Lucy's a part of is it's the first state-based commissioner role that we have. The Victorian government, of course, is looking at social procurement and does set some requirements for suppliers in that space as well. And it's quite possible they might look at what New South Wales is doing and what Lucy's talking about as a model. So I think that's also something to keep in mind over the course of today.
Fantastic. Thanks both. We'll come back to the questions, but maybe Alex and Sebastian, you might be able to pick up some of the questions and type in answers, but we'll come back to them after Lucy's session. I'm sure there'll be more questions following that. So let me now hand over to Lucy Roberts. As I said earlier, Lucy is a Senior Policy Advisor with the New South Wales Office for Anti-Slavery Commission, and we'd like to welcome her. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. Cheers.
Great, thank you very much, Kerry, for that introduction, and thanks also to Alex and Sebastian for a really fantastic overview, both of the legislative context and overlapping regulatory regimes worldwide, and also the very significant risks in the renewables industry. I might ask if it's possible to just pull up the slides. Sorry, Lauren, I'm not sure if you're able to share the slides I sent through. Wonderful. Next slide, please. So my presentation will, as Alex and Sebastian have, talk about modern slavery and its sort of relationship to the infrastructure sector in Australia and New Zealand. But as Kerry has foreshadowed, it'll specifically focus on legislation in New South Wales and my office's work and the impact that that sort of has more broadly on the Australasian infrastructure industry. So if we could go back a slide just to the acknowledgement of country, if that's okay. Thank you very much. So I'm speaking to you today from Cadigal and Wongal land, and as Kerry has already done, I do want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as Australia's First Nations people and custodians of the land, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any First Nations people joining today. The reason I did want to go back to the slide and highlight this is that one of the things we do emphasise in our work at the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner is that it's really important to acknowledge that First Nations people in Australia have survived historical practices that can be recognised and understood as modern slavery, and that they continue to live with those legacies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, I'll begin with an overview of modern slavery and discuss some of the legal reforms in New South Wales that created the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Probably whiz through that a little bit because Alex has given such a great overview. And I'll then move on to explain the work that our office has done, producing a framework of guidance material and resources to guide entities as they comply with the New South Wales modern slavery laws, and how we approach implementation of those laws. And I'll touch at the end, I think really relevantly given Sebastian's presentation, on the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's work towards a code of practice for modern slavery in renewable supply chains. So I think that that'll intersect really well with the risks and also the sort of due diligence measures that Sebastian has discussed that are being increasingly an increasing focus of the infrastructure industry. Next slide, please. So to begin with an overview of what we mean when we talk about modern slavery, and I think, as we sit in Australia and New Zealand, as Kerry has said, modern slavery kind of can often seem like a bit of a fact of history or a long way away. And the reality is that it's very deeply embedded in the global economy and in some commercial incentive structures. So the ILO estimates that up to 50 million people worldwide are enslaved, and best available survey-based evidence from the Walk Free Foundation puts an estimate of about 41,000 people in modern slavery in Australia and 8,000 in New Zealand. So organisations in Australia and New Zealand are connected through their supply chains, both local and global, and in some cases their operations, to activities of modern slavery which are ongoing. And that's reflected in the network of regulatory regimes worldwide, which Alex has touched on earlier. Next slide, please. So in terms of how modern slavery is defined in Australian law, it really covers quite a wide range of exploitation. So from human trafficking to forced marriage to organ trafficking to forms that perhaps we're a bit more familiar with in the infrastructure sector, like forced labour and debt bondage. And the common thread that ties all those forms of modern slavery together is people being treated as if they are owned. So if you think of the example of, for example, people, in developing countries being sold the Australian dream by recruitment agents or labour hire companies, they're brought to Australia to work in a lower paid job, perhaps, building roads in New South Wales, or, in cleaning work in our head offices. Perhaps their employer garnishes most of the money that they earn for debt to pay for their flights and accommodation. Maybe they have their passport taken. Perhaps they're working in very rural areas and don't speak English very well, so can't communicate. Their employer maybe controls their living situation or threatens their family back home. Next slide, please. So this example, next slide, please. So that sort of example does illustrate, as we can see in the slide, the kind of intersecting factors that produce modern slavery. So some industries can lend themselves to higher risks of exploitation, for example, because of low-wage jobs, geographic isolation, a reliance on sort of seasonal or gig work. People in those jobs can be vulnerable because of their visa status or their gender or other factors. And, sometimes there are also gaps or flaws in the legal and social safeguards that victims can fall through. Next slide, please. So I think as we've seen, there are some risks that are particularly specific to the infrastructure industry that do create, as Kerry has touched on, higher sort of proportions of modern slavery that are seen in the sector, particularly, in things like construction and renewables. So there's a really high demand for base skill labour. There's very complex global supply chains, particularly for things like raw materials and other risks that are associated with transport and logistics. And particularly, another factor that's particularly sort of relevant is the pressures that are put on suppliers globally because of tight timeframes and narrow margins. And we saw this particularly in during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there are, very sort of inflexible supply chains and real pressure on supply chains because of global events. There's also a lot of risks for infrastructure asset managers to consider in their operations or in the day-to-day, business of their assets. So, for example, people are often trafficked through airports or seaports. Next slide, please. So I'll move on now to talking a little about the modern slavery laws in New South Wales that created the Anti-Slavery Commissioner in my office and what they mean for the Australasian infrastructure industry more broadly. So the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act of 2018 it's a bit confusingly named for a couple of reasons. And the first of that is that the core obligations under that act actually came into force in 2022, so not until a few years later. And the second reason is that it actually has an identical name to the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act, which a lot of you will be a lot more familiar with, but quite a different scope. And we'll get into this in a moment. So in summary, the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act creates due diligence and reporting obligations for New South Wales public entities. So that means government agencies like Transport for New South Wales, Health, Planning, local councils, and also a range of other entities like local Aboriginal land councils or a small agency which we do like to pick on in our presentations, like the Chinese Medicine Council. So it's a surprisingly broad application. So all of these public entities have obligations to take reasonable steps to ensure that the goods and services that are procured by and for those organisations are not the product of modern slavery. And when I say goods and services, particularly relevantly for participants in this call, this includes construction procurement. Now, this isn't a thou shalt not buy piece of legislation. where products have heightened risks of modern slavery. We don't currently in Australia have, import bans in the same type that exist in Canada and the US, although those have been proposed. All procurement entails some risk of modern slavery. So the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act just creates a requirement for public entities to take reasonable steps to manage that risk in its context. Now, public entities also have to report annually on the reasonable steps that they're taking to manage those risks, similarly to obligations under the Commonwealth Act. And this act also creates the role of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who is an independent statutory officer who reports to Parliament rather than a minister. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's some natural confusion with the Commonwealth regime, between the Commonwealth and the New South Wales regime, and these exist side by side. So the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act, as Alex has said, includes corporate due diligence obligations. It applies to companies with $100 million turnovers or more, and it requires them to submit an annual statement to the Australian Border Force. There is some overlap in that the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act requires state-owned corporations, and relevantly that includes a number of infrastructure corporations like Landcom, the New South Wales Port Authority, Sydney Water, to report under the Commonwealth Act. So obligations under the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act are therefore reasonably specific to New South Wales public procurement. But that's actually really, really impactful both in and outside of New South Wales, and especially for the infrastructure sector. And the reason for that is that New South Wales government procurement is incredibly high, and particularly in the infrastructure sector. New South Wales government procurement has, I believe, an average annual value of over $42 billion. And a lot of this is in the infrastructure sector. I think Transport for New South Wales have procurement spending of up to $20 billion on infrastructure development. So really, really relevant for this sector to think about how to deal with these sorts of modern slavery risks. The other point is that large corporations in the infrastructure sector have also been reporting under the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act for a number of years. So many of them may be actually more familiar with these risks and have more sophisticated risk management systems than some entities in the public sector. So it's really important to work together. Next slide, please. So I want to turn now to the work that we've been doing at the Anti-Slavery Commissioner to assist covered entities, or to assist entities with obligations to implement the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act. Next slide, please. So in December last year, as Sebastian mentioned, our office published a number of resources for covered entities to use and adapt as they implement due diligence and reporting obligations. So we refer to this as the shared implementation framework because its ownership, in a sense, is shared with all the covered entities who have obligations under the Act. It's made up of 5 elements, each of which I'll talk to. The first and probably the keystone or the cornerstone of this framework is the Commissioner's guidance on reasonable steps. There's model contract and tender clauses. There's an inherent risk identification tool, and then there's the Commissioner's public register. Now, these are all publicly available on our website, and while they're obviously designed with the public entities covered by the New South Wales law in mind, they're intended to be read and applied as resources by entities from across the public and private sector, both in and outside New South Wales. Next slide, please. So starting with the Commissioner's guidance on reasonable steps, and you can actually scan the QR code that's on the screen right now to access the guidance and follow along. So recall that the key obligation under the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act is to take reasonable steps to ensure that goods and services procured are not products of modern slavery. And what reasonable steps is obviously very much a point on which there's been, some amount of uncertainty amongst covered entities. So the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's priority when he entered the role was to give clarity to entities that are implementing that act. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the guidance on reasonable steps does exactly what it says on the tin. It sets out 7 reasonable steps that extend along the life cycle of the procurement process and go to both operational and sourcing activities. And provides an overview of what steps at a sort of incremental level entities covered by the Act can take to ensure that they're managing their modern slavery risk adequately. So commitment, or commit rather, is the first step. And it's one that we'll be looking at the most when we monitor annual reporting and entities' sort of activities in the first few years of this Act being in force. And what it means is it requires entities to take those first steps to manage modern slavery risk by ensuring that they have a modern slavery policy and risk management processes in place. And this requires entities to engage with stakeholders throughout their value chains. And importantly, that includes people at risk of modern slavery. So we're really wanting to create a space where entities can approach this with a view to hearing from workers to find out how these risks emerge and how best to remedy them. So this will ensure that, and this is a major theme of the guidance that I do want to emphasize, is that the focus of due diligence efforts is on risk to people. So focusing efforts where the highest risk to people are, rather than risk to reputation or where an entity's highest spend is. The next three steps, so plan, source, and manage, are integrated with and reflect the New South Wales procurement framework. Remedy touches on the need to develop adequate grievance mechanisms and remediation plans. Report is tied to annual reporting obligations, as well as the steps that entities can take to report incidents of modern slavery that they identify to the relevant authorities. And improve sort of talks to that expectation of continuous improvement. There are benchmarks in the guidance on reasonable steps that, set expectations about where reporting entities will be year on year. And the speed of progress will obviously depend on the capability of those entities. As we've said, it covers a very broad range of entities. Next slide, please. So the guidance isn't prescriptive with regard to each step that an entity is expected to take. What it does instead is it provides resources, good practice, and case studies. And all of this is aligned with Australia's international commitments to, for example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which Alex mentioned earlier, the OECD guidelines, and other sorts of standards of international best practice. Next slide, please. I've included the appendices to the guidance here just to give you an idea of the range of resources we've aimed to provide in this document. So it's everything from an overview of international norms, to tips for identifying forced labour, to guidance on speaking with victim survivors, and remediation best practice. Next slide, please. I do want to quickly touch on the approach to due diligence in the guidance on reasonable steps. So again, the principle underlying the guidance is making sure that efforts are targeting risks to people. So due diligence obligations in light of this are informed by, firstly, the inherent risk of the product that's being procured, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the inherent risk identification tool, as well as the capability in terms of resources and leverage that an entity has. So obviously expectations of Transport for New South Wales are very different from those of a local Aboriginal land council that might have 5 employees, none of which are dedicated to procurement. Next slide, please. This one I'll skip over quite quickly, but I did want to emphasize that one area that entities both in the public and private sector have really expressed a need for guidance is around how do I design effective grievance mechanisms, and what do I do when I found a risk or an incident of modern slavery in my supply chain? How do I report, remediate, resolve this issue? And the guidance contains extensive sort of discussion of or explanation of how to approach these sorts of challenges, including this flowchart. Next slide, please. So to move now to the next element of the framework, the model contract clauses. These are a really key part of the framework, and they were developed in partnership with the Responsible Contracting Project, which grew out of an American Bar Association initiative, and Allens. They're expected to be, so there's obviously 2 versions, one for more higher risk procurements and one for a sort of streamlined version where that's not, where the due diligence expectations are somewhat lower. And there's an expectation that particularly in higher risk procurements, covered entities will include them in contracts but obviously not that they will renegotiate existing contracts. The core concept underlying these clauses is shared responsibility. So a move away from a sort of reps and warranties approach towards creating a framework for a buyer and a supplier to work together when incidents or risks are identified to remediate and to improve practices. So the converse approach, which is usually de-risking by terminating a contract with a problematic supplier, actually tends to compound harm to people, because what it does is it puts a lot of vulnerable people who are already experiencing situations of modern slavery suddenly out of a job. And that obviously leaves them exposed to further exploitation. Next slide, please. So the next pillar of the framework is the model tender clauses, which are based on a UK good practice model. These aim to provide a basis for effective supplier due diligence before a contract is entered into. Like the model contract clauses, there are different versions for lower versus higher risk procurements. Next slide, please. So I'll move now to an overview of the inherent risk identification tool, and I think this will be really, helpful for both public and private sector entities, and definitely is a resource that's intended to be used by both. So this illustrates how we look at risks associated with product categories at a global level. And to reiterate, if a product is high risk, it's obviously not a thou shalt not buy recommendation. It just sort of informs the level of due diligence and steps that entities are expected to take to learn about and, where possible, mitigate risk. I might skip through the next few slides just in the interest of time, but they're just intended to give you a further overview of what the IRIT is and what it looks like.
Thanks for that, Lucy. Just keen to leave a bit of time for questions.
No, of course. I might actually skip through these ones as well and just get to the Modern Slavery Code of Practice. So this was the final point I wanted to cover, which was the Anti-Slavery Commission has worked towards a code of practice of risks in renewables value chains. And this code will tie into the guidance on reasonable steps and reflect a consistent approach driven by the same underlying principles. Next slide, please. So why renewables? I think Sebastian's given a really great overview of why we've selected that to be the first code of practice that we prepare. There's huge risks in those supply chains, but also the New South Wales public sector is doing a really huge amount of critical work to accelerate the transition to net zero. So it's very relevant, I think, now to consider how we deal with those risks. There's also, I think still a lack of clarity on how public and private entities can best manage those risks, particularly where, as in, solar panel supply chains, it's very hard, if not impossible, to procure solar panels that are not to some degree associated with modern slavery. So the Anti-Slavery Commissioner is partnering with the Clean Energy Council to develop this code of practice. There's a process of consultation that's been ongoing throughout the last year, and we expect a draft code to be published for public consultation around the middle of this year. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what does this mean for the infrastructure industry in Australia and New Zealand? Basically, New South Wales public entities will first of all be focusing a lot more on modern slavery risks in their tender and contracting processes. And there'll also be, but at the same time, there'll also be opportunities for private sector infrastructure organisations to share their learnings and expertise and collaborate to improve leverage. And so one opportunity I do really want to highlight, I know we're getting up on time, is the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Forum, which we'll be holding on the 21st and 22nd of May. And that'll be a really key opportunity for this peer-to-peer learning process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that concludes my overview of the work of our work. And thank you very much to Kerry and to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council for this opportunity, and to you all for attending. If you do have any further questions, the details are on this last slide, which I'm sure we can share with you. And please do sign up to our due diligence news and resources distribution list.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lucy. I think that a number of the slides that you put up there and what you talked us through also answer some of the questions that have come up, and thanks also to the other panel and members and presenters for picking up and answering questions. I know that we'll be sending a transcript through, and any questions we don't get to, we'll ask our panelists to take a look at those after the session. But let me pick up on one question which I think, Lucy, you might be able to comment on. From Sarah, how much collaboration is there between the various jurisdictions to communicate abuses and fight modern slavery? And I think we've had questions from WA and Victoria as well about what's going on in the different states. So if you could comment on that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, certainly. So there is, obviously collaboration happening between the states. We have a sort of intergovernmental network that we meet with regularly to provide updates on, what's sort of what initiatives are going on and what work is being done to advance modern slavery initiatives. We also have a really great relationship with the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department, and obviously work with them, particularly as the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. The bill to establish an Anti-Slavery Commissioner progresses. We've really been following that quite closely, and the Commissioner, Dr. James Cockayne, has made submissions to that committee. And one area in particular that we're really trying to collaborate with and work with in the as that bill progresses is on the involvement of victim survivors of modern slavery in being able to participate in that process.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. There are also a number of questions about small organisations, small, maybe tier 2, tier 3. The people are obviously very keen to be able to respond and obviously need to respond, but it's just highlighting any resources which you've highlighted already there, Lucy, but maybe, and Sebastian and Alex, if you can join us, there may be some comments that you have for any pointers for people at the small end, people just getting started, about where they put their focus initially. So
Sure.
I don't know.
No, I'm happy to kick off, and I'll hand over to Sebastian and Alex.
Fantastic. Thanks.
So I think particularly with smaller organisations, we're actually sort of experiencing or hearing a lot about the resource challenges of addressing these risks as we continue to engage with, entities that are covered by this legislation, because obviously, as I've said, this covers like quite everywhere from quite small local councils and local Aboriginal land councils as well. And I think, as I've said, the area to focus efforts is really on the greatest risk to people. And there is quite a lot of work to be done there at the initial stages of scoping that risk. And we fully understand that there are capability challenges where perhaps you have like one person who's working 20% on procurement. That's a process that will take longer. And what reasonable steps look like, will be different from if you're a multi-million or billion-dollar organization. There are a lot of open source resources out there. Obviously, are the ones that are publicly available on our website are hopefully a helpful place to start as well. There's also a huge role for collaboration between industry or across industries and among the industry. So initiatives like the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, really bringing together entities across the sector is really important there.
Fantastic. Any last comments on that from either Sebastian or Alex, and then I'll wrap up for today.
Yeah, probably just a quick one. I think, whether it's small business, medium or large, I think and the resource one is a really interesting challenge. I think start with a small set of questions, if that's the capacity you have. If you're a medium-sized business, expand, and if you're a large business, you might have the resources to do it. And then look to progress those over time, whether it's the amount of questions that you're asking, or also the intent of the questions and for those outcomes. And I think that progression will give any business a great roadmap to take action.
Fantastic. Look, I'm going to draw a close there. I'd just like to say thanks so much to Sebastian, Alexander, and to Lucy for their sharing those insights. We've had a lot of information. We've had a high number of people attending the session, so it's clearly an area of interest and where people are wanting to learn more. As said, the answers to those questions will be sent out as part of the transcript along with presentation and the recording. So it just leaves me to say thanks so much for being here, for participating. This is a really important area related to, at its heart, to people. So it's a key part of that focus around sustainability. So thanks so much. I just want to remind people that when you leave, there'll be a survey to finish. So if you could complete that, and ka kite, have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.